Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 13. Meeting with Obadiah. The trip from Hogginstown back to Calirum in the morning hours of the 14th was very pleasant now that David and Beth were on speaking terms again. They talked about their experiences with the Rostim and Alewo, from their individual training practices to the fighting styles they had each adapted and developed. Because the Rostim and Alewo were allies, they freely spoke of their missions and of their fellow warriors. Beth mentioned that Ulrich wanted her to find a focal point in her life, but she never could because she felt that she had no reason to live. David said that he just concentrated on himself, since there was nothing out there for him anyway. As a result, they both had risen to the top of their ranks, but they each had an emptiness that they were desperately trying to fill. David learned more about the Alewo in that far too short a ride than he had learned from Tiberius in the entire time he had been Tiberius' pupil. While the Rostim placed a fair amount of emphasis on the sword, it seemed that the Alewo valued self-reflection over the attack. They determined a warrior should place the importance on preservation of self, and only kill if there were no other alternative to one's own survival. The Rostim did place their emphasis on protection, but they centered their concentration more on the tactics of the enemy, as opposed to preservation of self. Even with their combined knowledge of the two orders, neither of them knew how their leaders would handle a relationship that crossed both orders. During this war, and even throughout the Fempiror history, romantic relationships were rare, and while no one discouraged them, few pursued them. Tiberius had mentioned once that he generally placed couples together, since they usually made better teams. But Rostim and Alewo were separate disciplines, and they usually moved separately. Would their leaders still place them together, or would they need to move with their orders, only to meet when time allowed? While they were sure they were paired on this mission due to their past, they wondered if Tiberius and Ulrich were prepared to handle what they could only consider a best-case scenario. With the sun still well below the horizon, David spotted the hilly terrain south of Calirum and flew the levicart into the cave. He lowered the short legs and turned off the power, allowing the cart to rest on the ground again. He and Beth walked out of the cave and looked across the wide open plains toward the town in the distance, like an oasis of light in a sea of darkness. David sighed. "Well, it's time to go back to reality," he said. Beth smiled and slipped her hand in his. "I don't know," she replied. "Reality doesn't seem so bad anymore." "You ready to play your part again?" David asked, more to see how she would respond. Beth turned her head to look at him. "My dear sir," she said with mock surprise. "After a night such as this, it seems to me that when we walk into that town, there's at least one part of this charade that can no longer be considered as such." She leaned over and kissed him. "Whatever the world may think of us, I consider myself your wife now and forever. It isn't the Mrs. Taylor I thought I would become, but I am grateful that the centuries I have ahead will be spent with the one I love more than any other in this world." She took a step back, still holding his hand. "Let's go," she said. "We still have a job to do. Then we'll see about a proper honeymoon." He smiled and walked next to her the distance to Calirum, where, as husband and wife, they would finish the mission they had been given. And once back in Aram, they would talk to Tiberius and Ulrich about getting away for a short time to catch up properly. The Tepish stalemate would be there when they returned. As they neared the town, Beth leaned over to him. "Do you see the man sitting there on the left?" she said. David looked to the worn wooden box of a building that rested to the left of the main road into town. A man sat on the ground, leaning back against the building. As David watched him, he sat up suddenly, watching them. "I do," David replied. "He followed us to the inn last night after talking to the mayor," Beth said. David nodded. "I thought I heard someone outside our door," he said. "I hope he didn't overhear our conversation." "You did say a bit much considering the circumstances," Beth pointed out. Well, we'll just be more subtle tonight, David said with a shrug, and make sure our lock is plugged. Beth laughed. David enjoyed hearing her laughter again. It had been a long time since he had heard it, and it was just another indication that everything was going to be all right. They reached the edge of town, and the man from last night continued to stare at them. Evening, David greeted as they passed him. David could only suspect that the man looked confused because he and Beth had been so distant to each other the previous night. Or maybe he was surprised that they came back. How much time do we have left tonight? Beth asked. Only a couple of hours at most, David said. Maybe less. That should be enough to check out the town, though, and gather an idea as to what we're supposed to be looking for. We have what's left of this morning and only a few hours tonight. Thoughts as to a starting place? Beth nodded to a large, whitewashed building near the center of town. Beyond this building were only a few public stores before the houses began. I would guess that's the town hall, she said. Seems a little out of place considering the simplicity of the rest of the town. David nodded. I would agree, he said. Hogginstown is bigger than this, and our town hall looked like the rest of the buildings. True, Beth said. That doesn't necessarily mean the Tepish are involved, though. They may just love their town hall like Hogginstown loved Gerald Hoggins. David nodded again. It was hard to argue with that enormous statue. Start on the outside, he suggested. Sounds good, Beth said as they walked past Obadiah. They both waved to the mayor, who looked surprised as they passed him. They walked around the side of the building and glanced back to find that their follower had jogged up behind the mayor to speak to him. It looks like we won't get long to look, though, David said. I know, Beth agreed. How long do you think they'll give us? We might reach the eastern side over there, David suggested. Beth nodded, and they continued along the side of the building, which seemed a bit large for such a small town. David wondered why they needed so much room. When they walked around to the east side of the building, he noticed an enormous window that went from just above the ground to just below the roof, and was easily 8 feet wide. Have you ever seen a window that large before? David asked upon seeing the feature. Never, Beth replied. This town hall gets more interesting the longer we look at it. David nodded in agreement. Even though the Fempiror shared the town with humans, it was strange for any building, even more so a building used by Fempiror, to have a window so large. They walked towards the window to look inside, but before they reached it, someone jumped against the inside of the glass, causing both of them to jump back in surprise. The person snarled at them like an animal, standing on all fours just inside the glass. Considering how hard the person hit, the glass must have been very thick to stand up to the force. Beth, look at his teeth, David said, peering at the person whose mouth hung open hungrily as he stared at them. The person's canine teeth were long and pointed, just as a vampire's teeth were said to be, according to the stories. I think that's the person I saw in Aram, Beth said, but before they could look at it too long, their follower approached them from behind. Excuse me, he said, clearly trying to draw their attention from the strange person with the pointed teeth. They turned to him. Yes, David said, actually a bit annoyed at the interruption. The last thing he expected upon their return to Calirum was to find anything interesting, so their follower's interruption was unappreciated. Mayor Obadiah wishes to see you, their follower said. David calmed himself so his irritation would not show through. Sure, he said, gathering his usual demeanor. What's going on? Behind them, the person jumped against the glass again. David and Beth both turned to the sound, but this time David caught movement behind the one against the window. As he worried that there might be more than one of them in there, he noticed that, curiously, their follower had not said anything to draw their attention. David turned to him and found, to his surprise, that the creature had surprised their follower as well. Was it possible that this person knew nothing of this? After a muttered to recover himself, their follower continued. Just some routine questions we ask of everyone who comes here, he said in a shaky voice. Won't take long. We just missed you before you left after sunset. Very well, David nodded. He took Beth's hand in his, and they followed the man, who quickly led them back around the building. Beth leaned over to David. "Good timing," she whispered. "That's what I thought," David agreed. "But did you notice his surprise?" "I did," she said. "Strange." "I know," David agreed. As they walked away, he heard the person crash against the glass wall again. He could not help but wonder how long that glass, regardless of its reinforcement, would hold against someone that violent. He also wondered what the existence of such a person meant for their mission here. Obadiah had been sitting on the front stoop of the city hall most of the night. Calirum was a small, restful town, so on most nights, unless they had newcomers, he had very little to do. Vladimir and his team had left several hours ago, and since then he had been waiting to see if the two strangers from the previous night would return. That was his job this evening. Their rapid departure had confused both him and Fempiror, but the strangers' lives were their lives. They had done nothing to warrant any kind of suspicion, other than coincidentally arriving on the evening that the alchemist had told him to watch for newcomers. He had sent Fempiror to wait on the edge of town to watch for them, so he would hopefully have some kind of warning when and if they returned. Then he saw the pair walk right by him and wave. He watched them, surprised, and looked behind them to see Fempiror running to catch up. So much for the legendary training of the Tepish. Perhaps the easy life had made Fempiror soft. "How's the watch going?" Obadiah asked, very annoyed. "Sorry, sir," he said calmly. "They caught me off guard. I had stopped expecting them." "Clearly you were off guard," Obadiah chastised. "What are they doing?" Fempiror shrugged. "Walking." "What are they talking about?" Obadiah asked, hoping Fempiror had done at least some part of his job. "I can't get close enough to find out," Fempiror said, irritated. "Don't allow them to walk around the building," Obadiah said desperately. "Bring them to me." "What reason should I give?" Fempiror asked. Obadiah thought quickly. Fempiror knew nothing of the Tepish experiments, and given how horrible it all seemed to Obadiah, he had no desire to tell Fempiror any of it. But if this pair was allowed to see the window, they would see the thing back there. "Routine questions," Obadiah replied. Easy answer, he thought. Fempiror nodded. "Yes, sir," he said, and ran off to follow their guests. Obadiah moved quickly inside the city hall. He was certain that the alchemist would want to listen in to this conversation. He made his way swiftly through the hidden door to the first room on the right, where he found the alchemist in his laboratory, away from the subject and the guard. The alchemist's laboratory boggled Obadiah's mind every time he saw it. A wide counter stretched around the three walls without the door. Scattered in a haphazard fashion as far as Obadiah's knowledge went were glass containers of all sizes, several lamps, papers and pens along with inkwells, a couple of Nilroth that Obadiah knew the alchemist used to draw his own blood, which he used in his tests, and a few containers of substances that Obadiah knew nothing about. In the center of the room was a table that the alchemist used as a desk, with a couple of paper piles and a few of the small glass vials in a wooden holder that contained the mutated Fempiror serum. Behind this table, the alchemist sat in a chair and stared blankly at the floor, unmoving. "Sir," Obadiah said as soon as he entered the room. There was a thud from the direction of the test subject's room, and Obadiah shot his gaze behind him. Since those things were no more intelligent than animals, he was always concerned that they would break out. "What is it, Obadiah?" the alchemist said in a hollow voice. "Sorry to interrupt," Obadiah began, turning back to him, "but the newcomers have returned." The alchemist suddenly looked at him, interested. "Fempiror is bringing them around now. I thought you might want to listen in to my interview." "Yes, of course," the alchemist said with renewed vigor. He immediately got up and walked back toward the public part of the city hall. Obadiah followed him through the secret panel and the alchemist walked into a small observation room hidden behind Obadiah's office, placed there by the Tepish to allow them to view any conversations Obadiah had with people of the town. While he knew that the alchemist could watch him at any time, he also knew that the alchemist had little interest in doing so this room was vacant most of the time. Obadiah walked to his office and sat behind his desk to wait for Fempiror to bring the newcomers to him. After only a few moments, the door opened, and Fempiror escorted the pair into his office, who had claimed to be a recently transmutated husband and wife. Obadiah noticed that Fempiror looked a little shaken. He gathered that the pair had reached the east side of the building, and the mutation had jumped at them. Fempiror must have seen it. Obadiah looked to his guests and stood to greet them. "Welcome to Calirum," he said with a smile. "I ask your pardon for being remiss in welcoming you properly." "Think nothing of it," David said. "Sit, please," Obadiah said. "Thank you," Beth said as they all took their seats with the exception of Fempiror, who stood next to the door watching them. Obadiah leaned on the desk and folded his hands as he looked them over. "So," he began, "when were you two attacked? What happened?" "We had just gotten married," David began, "and we were spending some personal time together before going to work and life. We were out late, so we decided to stay the night in a cave. But there was something in there with us. It attacked me first. Beth was screaming. I heard her, but I couldn't do anything." "He had this pointed thing that he stuck in our necks," Beth interrupted. "It was cold." "When we came to," David continued, "we were in this huge building. I've never seen anything so big before. Anyway, they gave us these things they called, David trailed off and looked at Beth. "Neil Ruff?" Beth half asked, looking at David. "Neil Ruff," Obadiah said, filling in the blank for them. "That's it," David said, nodding. "They gave us each one of those, and said to draw our own blood and inject it into other regular people. They said we had to bring them one a week. That's the Aram quota," Obadiah said. An aversion to the quota from Aram was a primary reason why most people found their way to Calirum, so these two were meeting the profile of the refugees very nicely. A little too nicely, actually. "We couldn't do it," Beth said, shaking her head. "Once they let us go," David continued, "we threw those horrible Neorofs away and have been hiding out during the days." "They just let you go, and you threw the Neorof away?" Obadiah asked, confused. David looked at him for a moment, as if trying to come up with a reply. "Well," David began hesitantly, we agreed to do everything they told us to. We were too scared to refuse. They thought we were on their side and would work for them. They held us for 3 or 4 days before we were allowed to go out and find people to change. Their attitude toward regular people was frightening. Most regular people would try to kill us under the belief that we are demonic, Obadiah filled in for them. He was relaxing with them a little, but still wary. "We heard a lot of stories like that," David continued, "some from people recently changed, and others from people who had been changed for a while. We knew they wouldn't just release us," Beth piped up. "We just had to wait for our chance. A couple days ago, they sent us out to find people to change. We told them we would, but we never went back." "How did you find your way to us?" Obadiah asked, wondering how well this story was spun. "We had stayed over one night at an inn on the edge of that Aram city," Beth said. "The man behind the counter told us about this town that had a bunch of new people like us who threw away their Neorofs and ran away." "Interesting," Obadiah prompted. "He pointed the way to go, and here we are," David finished. "Quite the harrowing adventure," Obadiah said encouragingly. And rather neatly told, he thought to himself. "It was," Beth said, nodding. Obadiah thought he would explore a point that Fempiror mentioned regarding the unusual shape in the man's rucksack. "I notice you carried a sword," Obadiah said. "How did you come by this?" David chuckled. "How did you know I had a sword?" "Fempiror saw how odd your rucksack was shaped and made a guess," Obadiah said, happy that Fempiror had looked so closely. "We were in Aram the other night," David answered with a shrug, and witnessed a fight between a group of soldiers from the big building and two other groups. I took the sword for my own protection from the carnage." "Do you know how to use it?" Obadiah asked him suspiciously. "Not yet, but I am hoping for some initial intimidation," David replied with a shrug. Obadiah nodded. The story was plausible, but he wondered if it was actually true. Given how completely the sword fit in the rucksack, he thought the man might have answered too easily about it. Then again, he still knew nothing about these strangers, but they were being peaceable and had not caused any trouble so far. He had no reason to detain them at present, but he would continue to watch them. "Well, your story seems true enough," Obadiah responded finally, "but let me assure you that the sword will not be necessary as long as you're here." "Can I at least keep it?" David asked calmly. He did not seem to be the least bit concerned about losing this weapon, which made Obadiah think that perhaps they were telling the truth. He was obliged to give the basic rules to them. "You cannot carry it through town," Obadiah informed him. "We prohibit any weapons in our streets. We are a peace-loving people and do not wish to get involved in any kind of disputes. There is some kind of war going on between factions of the older Night Dwellers. The Tepish are the ruling faction, and the others seek to unseat them. It is a pathetic struggle that goes back centuries. They refuse to come to an agreement, and we, the little people, suffer for it. It is from this invisible war of theirs that you and I and everyone in this town were changed. We will have no part of it." David nodded. "That's fine," he said. "I'm no fighter." Obadiah smiled at them. Perhaps he was wrong to be suspicious of them after all. "Good," he said. "I will present you to the other Fempiror in charge tomorrow. He will want to meet you." "Oh, you aren't in charge?" Beth asked him, surprised. "Yes and no," Obadiah replied reluctantly. "I am the mayor, so I am over this town. But for the moment, I report to a higher authority as well." "Who is he?" David asked quickly. A little too quickly for Obadiah's taste. Regardless of whether this was an innocent question or not, he felt it best to allow the alchemist to deal with this pair when he felt like doing so. The alchemist had not interrupted the interview, so he was uncertain what would happen. "If he wishes to tell you his name," Obadiah replied cryptically, "he will do so. Fempiror will help you back to your room." They exchanged some parting pleasantries, and Obadiah wished them a pleasant stay in his town before Fempiror escorted them back out. He hoped that this evening Fempiror might hear some part of their conversation that would let them know something about their past or intentions here in Calirum. So far, his most effective servant had been completely ineffective with this pair, which did give him some cause for suspicion. Behind him, the door between his office and the observation room slid open. The alchemist stepped into his office and stood behind him. Obadiah turned to find that the alchemist had a very self-satisfied look on his face. "Well?" Obadiah asked. "I saw what I needed to see," the alchemist replied. "What is your determination?" Obadiah asked. He was honestly tired of these games and wanted a straight answer. "They are spies," the alchemist said without a trace of hesitation. "I would doubt he took the sword. It is most likely his. I know of him as a skilled Rostem warrior. His wife, if she really is most likely just as formidable, though I could not say which discipline. I will see them tomorrow, and they will not leave." The alchemist left and closed the door behind him without another word. Obadiah was surprised that the alchemist was so certain about this. The newcomers had only just arrived. However, the alchemist had been with the Tepish for some time, and perhaps he had seen them before. He had no way of knowing, of course, and he knew the alchemist would not tell him. The alchemist was secretive about everything unrelated to his mutation work. It did not matter any longer, however. The alchemist would deal with the newcomers tomorrow evening, and whatever fate was in store for them, they were not going to leave town. Following their meeting with Obadiah, David and Beth walked behind their follower, whose name they learned was Fempiror, as he led them back to the Calirum Inn. David was uncertain whether Obadiah believed them or not, but it would not matter soon enough. They would make a quick reconnaissance tomorrow evening, learning what they could, and then report to Tiberius and Ulrich. Calirum would be behind them, and their future would be ahead. Fempiror stopped in the lobby of the inn as they waved to Fiona, who greeted them when they entered. She was on her way out, however, so they continued up to their room. He and Beth had not spoken to each other yet, and he was eager to get her take on Obadiah's interview with them as soon as they had a few minutes alone. He doubted, however, that Fempiror would allow them that time. As close as Fempiror tried to stay, they both surmised that his job was to listen to them. They walked to room 202 and unlocked the door. He glanced behind them as Beth entered the room and spotted Fempiror at the top of the stairs. This confirmed that privacy was not in their plans for the morning. David entered the room and gestured to Beth for the candle. He glanced to the stairs, and Fempiror had backed down a step to wait patiently just out of sight. He lit the candle using the sconce in the hall and entered the room, closing the door behind them. He handed Beth the candle, and she set it on the table. She looked back at him. There was very little open floor space in the room, so attempting to find any space out of sight of the keyhole was out of the question. David knelt down and looked under the door. Predictably, he saw Fempiror's knees, and assumed that Fempiror was looking through the keyhole. Not very subtle, in David's opinion. David gestured to Beth for his rucksack. She picked it up from next to the table with the candle and handed it to him. "This reminds me of when I asked your father if I could marry you," he said, as he hung his rucksack on the doorknob, blocking the hole. Beth smiled and shook her head. "Strictly speaking, we shouldn't have been out so late anyway, even if it was the only time we could get a few moments alone." As Beth spoke, their eyes followed the sounds of Fempiror standing up and walking to room 203. Room 203's door opened and closed. "But you know how it is with young couples, though," David continued as they sat casually on the bed next to the wall separating the rooms and looked it over carefully. They had not given the wall a second glance the night before, but now that they had a visitor behind it, it warranted another look. "Everyone feels like they are just going to get into trouble if allowed to wander off." "Well," Beth began, "we would have done better that night if it weren't for that hole in the floor." Beth pointed to a small hole in the wall. "It did make a mess of us, didn't it?" David said as he placed his ear to the wall, listening for movement. The bed next door creaked as Fempiror climbed on it. Something slid against the wall, most likely a small panel that covered the hole that looked into this room. But it sort of opened the door to my asking. Beth nodded. "I wondered if he would see it our way." David moved his body directly in front of the peephole and listened again. "I think I covered it pretty well," David replied. There was silence for a long moment, and then the panel slid closed. He heard the bed creak again, sounding as if Fempiror had lain down. David smiled and sat on the bed to one side of where the hole was. He gestured for Beth to sit with him on the bed. She smiled, moved next to him, and leaned her head onto his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. She reached across his body and held his opposite hand in hers. "You didn't cover anything," she said softly. "That was probably the most impulsive proposal in the history of the world." David chuckled. "Still, now that the issue is closed, it's a matter of waiting to see what happens next." Beth hit him gently on the chest. "I was being serious." "Me too," David said. He sighed. "You know, I can't believe I just blurted it out either. Still, he didn't say no." Beth smiled. "No, he didn't." She quietly traced the lines on his hands. It was peaceful. "There is a lot to talk about when we get back," she said quietly. "Like what?" David asked. 10 years is a long time," Beth said. "A lot went on that you need to know." "Well, we'll have plenty of time," David said, and held her a little closer. She sighed happily as she lost herself in the moment. "How long do you think he'll stay there?" she asked softly. David shrugged. "He laid on the bed over there," he replied, "so he'll probably rest when he thinks we're asleep." Beth turned her head up to look into David's eyes and smiled. "Who says we're going to sleep?" she asked deviously. He smiled and kissed her briefly. Good point," he said. They kissed again and lay down, as snoring echoed from the room next door.